I tend to walk around a lot, so sorry. Out of curiosity, how many people in the room know what the word prattle means? It's like more hands than usual. So it's one of those SAT words that very few people remember. So it means idle chatter or gibberish, right? So what we do at Prattle is we analyze the content of market-moving communications and generate quantitative data based on those communications. So we take that gibberish that moves markets and actually quantify it. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'll give you a little bit of background on us, on me, and what we do, but actually what I'm going to talk about is how to mitigate cognitive biases and what technology can do in that space, specifically AI and machine learning. How to utilize these novel tools to really be able to generate novel insights, cleaner insights that actually, to this audience, matters for your user experience, right? Little background on what we do. As I said, we quantify market-moving language. We focus on both central banks and corporate communications. And our client base is primarily hedge funds, investment banks, large asset managers. And of course, we focus on increasing profits, improving performance, but also on marketability. This is one of those things that people kind of forget about in the capital market space, but it's highly important. Most hedge funds don't survive. The ones that do are good at marketing themselves. And so being able to actually talk about that in the context of using novel tools, how you present that information is extremely important. And of course, then there's the fiduciary duty aspect. The other piece I will talk about if I have time is how user interfaces are changing in this space. It used to be a world of just APIs, right, or FTP, all back-end data feeds. Now we're moving towards the so-called quantamentals, people who are fundamental investors who want to get toward being more quantitative, who need data visualization tools because they don't know how to do it themselves, but they need a user-friendly interface. So I tend to think in the context of multi-decade or multi-century background. I'm a macroeconomist by training, so I'm sorry. The sort of basic premise I start from is that the financial market, really financial research, anything in finance, hasn't really changed in 100 years. There's also a fly up here, so I apologize if I'm swatting aimlessly. And so essentially, if you think about it, if JP Morgan woke up from the dead today, right, the only thing he would say is like, oh good, all the data's in one place now, right? The Bloomberg terminal. Congratulations, that's a 30-year-old innovation. So what we think about a lot is how do you take the things that were never centralized, that were never localized into one place, and actually aggregate all of that information? In our case, we think about quantifying that information. But one of the challenges that our clients face is that they are extraordinarily busy. Now, one of our investors will also tell me frequently they're also dumb and lazy, but most of the time, we just think about our clients as being extremely busy. They don't have time to look up from one of their 6 screens to do something different. So we have to be able to alert them to information. That means taking something like an earnings call and generating a singular quantitative report, which may be a little hard to see on the screen, but that's a singular score representing how positive or negative an earnings call was. In this case, Disney's. Disney's is fun because they put a little Mickey Mouse on it. And so, of course, being able to provide that quantitative information as an alert, right? So if you think about if you walk through a trading floor, if any of you spend any time in banks, you walk through a trading floor, everybody has at least 2, typically 3, sometimes 4, 5, or even 6 screens in front of them. They're not opening up a new window. It's not going to happen. So you have to be able to get their attention somehow. I kid you not, the biggest innovation in our business was when we started doing email alerts. I don't know about you guys, but I get way too much email, and it blows my mind that our client base actually still relies on their emails. So of course, this is just to discuss what we actually do. We build a unique lexicon based off of how the market has historically responded to prior communications. So if a company has an earnings call, we control for all of the known quantitative factors that affect price movement, and then isolate in on the residual price movement left over, right? The things that are unexplained by the known quantitative factors, and declare that to be sentiment. We build a unique lexicon specific to that individual company. And so we've actually built out a unique lexicon on every publicly traded company in the US. So it's about 4,000 unique lexicons in the US alone, not to mention doing the same thing for 20 central banks around the world. The end result is the ability to take what is a messy communication, right, one of those earnings calls, and generate a singular quantitative score, right? Much, much easier to interface with that information. So this is the in case you don't believe me slide. It actually does work. Our central bank product's been in the market for a couple of years. The Fed uses it. They actually refer to it as their definitive source of definitive metric of their own sentiment, as the Financial Times also has done a whole bunch of cool graphics with it. So, all right, so now let's actually talk about bias, right? The thing that I think is most pervasive in this space that nobody wants to talk about, right? So here's some statistics for you. Again, an economist, I apologize. 90% of analysts admit to using quote unquote additional caution when writing on sensitive topics, right? 33% of analysts admit to avoiding damaging investment banking relationships, avoid damaging their investment banking relationships in their analysis, right? So 42% of analysts believe that sell-side research has a detrimental short-term focus, right? These are the people talking about their own research, think that they're doing things that are bad for the market. And 65% of analysts do not believe that sell-side research tackles controversial topics or offers negative assessments of companies where appropriate. They are shying away from saying bad things because they want to continue to have access to the people who give them information. That's not good, right? There has to be a better solution here. There has to be a better way of analyzing the publicly available information and then being able to convey that to clients. There's something better than a 60-page report based on a 30-page transcript based on a 2-hour phone call. So, taking an example of probably the most egregious case of cognitive bias I've seen in the last couple of years. You guys all remember Brexit? If you've been to London recently, I promise you'd remember it. I was there a few weeks ago. I'm back there again next week, and it is still very real. Right after the Brexit vote, when the UK was still in shock, there was this pervasive belief that the Bank of England was about to cut rates. The governor of the Bank of England, a guy named Mark Carney, gave this speech. I think it was July 5th of last year. In this speech, he had some relatively dovish things to say at the introduction, a pretty moderate speech in general in the middle, and a pretty dovish conclusion. So how does every busy person read? You read the intro, you skim the middle, you read the conclusion. So every single article, every single one, talked about how dovish this speech was. Everybody had the prior, Brexit's bad for the economy. They key in only on the dovish language in the speech, and the end result is, hey, look at this. They're gonna cut rates. They're definitely gonna cut rates. He basically said that we're gonna do whatever it takes, right? Well, never mind the fact that his verb tense was all about what they're already doing. And look what happens, right? We're the only ones who scored that speech as neutral, a little bit on the hawkish side even. And the end result was that, as far as I know, we're the only people out there on record, way out of consensus, saying there's no way they're gonna cut rates yet. Sentiment hadn't fallen far enough. And the trick to what we did here is pretty simple. We built a comprehensive, unbiased, quantitative metric for analyzing language. It's not anything crazy here. We've just taken language, matched it up to how the market has historically responded, and built a unique algorithm specific to that central bank. And so based on the historical patterns in their language, what he was saying was just not that dovish. And so, of course, the end result is they held rates. The market got crushed. And of course, they cut rates a month later, as our model projected, because of course, sentiment continued to fall. So this is just one of those proof points to say, there's a whole bunch of these instances, This is a graph demonstrating every one of the G10 central banks. Each one of the policy calls that the market got right, got wrong, the ones that we got right and got wrong. You'll note there's only one orange dot there. That orange dot indicates the one that we got wrong, that the market got right, the only one in the last 18 months. It's the problem with having a purely algorithmic system. New central banker. New central bankers never cut rates in their first meeting. It destroys inflation expectations. So despite the fact that the model was calling for a rate cut, any human overlay would have solved that problem. This is an important point that I think underpins everything that matters here, and I'll come back to that. As you can see in the equity universe, this bias is so pervasive that it has wrecked performance, right? So actively managed funds have been underperforming because of people's biases. So being able to tap into AI and machine learning, right, to utilize a algorithmically built system that adapts to the natural evolution of language, right, has been able to mitigate these biases. I'm not going to say that none of our clients are in that 84%, but the vast majority are not. And of course, this is proof positive that, hey, look at this. If you actually take an unbiased approach, see how the orange lines go up and the blue lines are relatively flat. Orange lines are what happens when you actually utilize data that is predicated on an unbiased approach. So this, of course, breaks down into the sector level and the individual equity level, right? So everybody loves Apple. One of the amazing things about Apple is, of course, if you built a unique lexicon specific to Apple, anytime they mention that iPhone sales goes down, that's really bad. But of course, that same language, identical language, would actually be great for Google, right? And so being able to specialize, right? Being able to key in on individual company language is vital in this space, right? That's what analysts do that's so special, is that they know the difference between the language at Apple and the language at Google. We've now reached a point where we can algorithmically generate information that is just as insightful, that is just as specialized to those companies, right? So the lexicon for Apple is built entirely off of how the market has historically responded to prior Apple communications. Here's the other fun part about this, cost savings. How many of you are familiar with MiFID II? Wow, that's a pretty sparse group. All right. So for those of you who don't know what MiFID is, actually out of curiosity, how many of you know what GDPR is? Okay, so we're gonna talk about regulation for a minute. I know it's a bit of a tangent, but it's actually really important in this space. MiFID II is the new regulatory framework in Europe that goes into effect on January 3rd. The interesting piece about MiFID, or I should say the most interesting piece, is the fact that essentially it's forcing the investment banks to line item out the cost of research. They can no longer lump it into trading costs, which means anybody who manages assets, anybody who relies on an investment bank for clearing, right? They're not going to get free research anymore, period. You can't. Not if you have any operations in Europe. So essentially all the banks are trying to figure out what to do, how to solve this problem of, all right, we now have to actually charge for something that we've quote unquote been giving away for free, lumping it in with trading costs. And so it's now this fascinating moment of banks trying to figure out how to really to improve their research because they have to compete with the independent providers, expand their coverage, and cut costs all at the same time. And so it's this interesting moment for technological adoption, right? Because these numbers are basically necessary. These are table stakes to continue to do what they've been doing. The GDPR component, by the way, should matter for this group quite a bit, is that goes into effect later, I want to say in March or April. That is the data privacy law in Europe. And what's interesting about GDPR is that you cannot retain data on any individual. So this is a big nightmare for Google in particular, but basically any social network, any place where you might be reaching out to individuals, you actually cannot retain that data. The EU citizen actually owns that data. which makes it really interesting when you're trying to reach out to people over and over again, because you're not actually supposed to retain their contact information. And so there's a whole bunch of waivers and things like that you need to go through. And so it's changed the landscape of the regulatory world. And frankly, it's changed the financial data landscape, because there's a whole bunch of companies that have sprung up analyzing social media for financial information that may or may not be able to survive that. So the biggest question I typically get when I talk about mitigating bias, when I talk about using AI and machine learning in your investment process is, oh yeah, but isn't everybody already doing that? The answer is no. In fact, very, very few places are. This has been the most striking and surprising thing for me. I'm a recovering academic, and when I came out of academia, I just assumed the entire financial services world, given how much everybody was paid, surely they were using all of these processes. Surely these things we've known in academia for a decade were in wide use. Yeah, that was false, continues to be false. In fact, as of a few weeks ago when Bloomberg published this, only 18% of asset managers are actively using machine learning in their process. Only another 24% are even researching it. I can tell you, I know several trillion-dollar asset managers who do not have a centralized data lake. I think our director of sales said it best, was sometimes when we have conversations with people in the space, if their investors knew what they didn't know, they'd be terrified. And this is the challenge in the space is there's a lot of people who think they're doing this, who have been trying to do this, or just want to do this, who aren't there yet. And so being able to show them, really in stark terms, the value of being able to utilize AI and machine learning tools to do things like mitigate your own cognitive biases is actually really important. I'll end with my favorite slide, which is, if anybody's as big a nerd as I am, you probably were a chess fan. I'm going to say no one is. Gary Kasparov is a chess grandmaster who very famously, 20 years ago now, was beaten by Deep Blue. This was the first time a grandmaster had ever been beaten by a machine doing brute force computing. He came out with a new book earlier this year that I highly recommend. And what was really interesting about the book is he talks about embracing technology. And embracing technology in this context does not mean technology replacing the human. It means working together. And over the last decade plus, what you find is cyborg chess teams, so human paired with a machine, have beaten every chess grandmaster and have beaten all of the other machines. So what does this tell us right now, right? We know that AI and machine learning have not reached a point where they can operate autonomously and outperform a human plus a machine. So we should be leveraging technology in every aspect of our decision making, using it to recommend things, mitigate our own biases, and actually result in optimal or closer to optimal decision making. So I'll leave it at that. I have a whole bunch of slides on our platform, but I will take a couple of questions instead.
Any questions from the audience? All right, there we go. Oh, I'll go over here first.
So I loved your first example of you guys being wrong that one time because the machine didn't know this kind of human bias, right? That a human isn't going to do that the first time they're in this committee or board, or I don't know the language. But isn't there a way to program the machine with that knowledge as well? I mean, so I'm wondering, like, I love the idea of machines not replacing us. I think that's a great idea. So I love the idea of, like, of human machine combining to make, like, super awesome force to deal with. But it seems like eventually all of that can be stuff that the machine knows. Is that what you're saying? Like, right now things are good, but eventually?
Well, so to use the example from, like, the automotive space, right? 30 years ago, when you started using mechanical arms to lift things that were heavy in auto manufacturing, yeah, it replaced a few jobs, but it was really just people who were operating heavy machinery to lift things up. As they got more advanced, those robotic arms were able to do more and more intricate tasks and started to replace more and more of those jobs. we're really early in that curve when it comes to things as complex as making financial decisions. There are also just some things that machines are better at than people. Digesting huge amounts of information rapidly, right? So there's something on the order of 7 million words per week that are published by publicly traded companies in the US during earnings season. No human being can consume 7 million words per week. It's not happening. You're not going to get anything useful out of that. So there are things machines are already better at than us. There are things that machines are getting better at and are not as good as us. Right now, for the foreseeable future, human plus machine still beats just machines. That's not going to be true forever.
So along those lines, building upon that a little bit, we explore the ethics the ethical responsibility we have as designers, technologists, innovators, in terms of considering externalities. And it's almost like we don't know how to regulate or develop guidelines or policies for things that we haven't foreseen. But as you can tell by her question and mine, we're kind of foreseeing this. So how have you thought about the ethical considerations or guidelines, all of the bots we're making, technobots, may displace human jobs, and how do we kind of design for the human component as well? So just curious about your thoughts there.
So I'll go back to a concrete example that I deal with on an almost daily basis. We launched this new equity data a couple months ago now, and I now talk to a lot of equity analysts. One big investment bank, I was at a lunch they put on, and the analyst informed me that the rumor going around internally is that they have 300 analysts on staff right now. As a result of MiFID, by this time next year, they'll be down to 100. So she was nearly in tears telling me this, and my response was pretty simple, which is if you're the person who embraces technology first, you'll keep your job. And I know that's cynical, but it's true. And so being able to utilize technology, being able to leverage it, can make people better at their job, more efficient at their job, more effective. That's not to say that there aren't ethical considerations to what happens to those other people, but being able to leverage technology can help mitigate those losses, right? So, and that's not to say people need to be retrained. It's incumbent on us as people who design products for those folks to make it as easy as possible for them to adopt that. I should also note, by the way, the other interesting fact about this is if you think about the equity universe, the vast majority of equities actually have no research coverage. 60% of equities traded globally have no research coverage, right? So 40% in this country alone. So the fact is we could actually change that by having the same number of people covering more stocks, having better, more complete information for the market, which means that nobody loses their job. We're all just better at understanding what's going on in the market dynamics. So there's a whole lot of ways to leverage technology to improve the situation, not just to take people's jobs. I'm getting the time is up sign, so thank you very much. Thank you.